It's Brainwash with Dr. Tom and Guitar Picks with Eric Perrottii. J.S. Bach, the first cello suite performed by Michael Hedges.
That particular recording, and I used to know that piece, and I can play the first two or three, four bars for you. That recording that I have is by Michael Hedges. A lot of people are not that aware of his recording, but it's this piece that goes. We played in the key of D, originally written in a lower key of G, because you can't really do it in the original key on a guitar. Michael Hedges used a harp guitar, which is a guitar that has this enormous harp section that has low strings placed on there, and he's the only guitarist that I know of that did it in the original key, but I wish I could have said a lot more about him. He was one of the most amazing guitar players that ever existed, and that first cello suite, the only recording that I know of that was actually done in the original key of G.
Okay, of course it's interesting that as a guitarist you selected a cello thing, right?
That is interesting, and for years I wondered why Bach wrote this for the cello. Now, there weren't really not guitars around in his day, but he was an incredible lute player, which is an early form of a guitar with more of a mandolin-shaped body. You may remember that from our days playing at the medieval restaurant. But he was quite the lutenist, as we call it, and until I heard Yo-Yo Ma play this on the cello, I never realized why he wrote it for cello. But Bach, being, again, a very big influence for me, and many classical guitar players, or at least people who have somewhat that background, tend to love Bach. He was just a genius. He was a great improviser. He followed structure and didn't let anybody know it so blatantly that it seemed boring. He followed structure and still created great melody, especially with that particular cello suite, I believe, which is not the hardest one on guitar. It's probably the easiest one. But if you hear Yo-Yo Ma play it on cello, you'll understand why he wrote it on cello. But from my knowledge, Bach wrote pieces on an instrument because that's the instrument he was holding at the time. He probably would have sat down thereafter and played it on the lute if he wanted to. To me, it just sounds like a guitar piece. But you can also look at this list, and as we go down now, we've already mentioned ukulele and pieces that are not necessarily guitar pieces, like Blue Sky, as we mentioned a little while ago. Maybe Girl from Ipanema, but as we get a little closer to the basement of the list here, you find some things that are kind of kept in the basement, but just a few. I try to keep them as guitar-oriented as possible. But for me, it is not necessarily only guitar music that influences what I do, because I'm more of a composer, I think, than anything else, and that's why I don't keep as much of my classical repertoire as I probably should, because I'd rather be writing. But these are the pieces I think that influence me as a composer, but also in my technical respect. These are things that I learned how to do things with, like the Robert Johnson, like this cello suite, learning how to play that kind of classical guitar music, or learning how to play a slide with the Robert Johnson. Anyway, there you go.
So far, of the ones on the list, would you say this is probably the oldest that you've selected, and overall as well?
I would say maybe, probably so. A few pieces down, there's a piece that's more of an improvisation based on ancient ragas, which are Indian scales, which may have more of an ancientness to it. But the piece itself is not old. So, but yeah, probably the oldest, yeah. Because that would go back 300 years ago, Bach. And to hear that, you almost wouldn't think it. It almost could sound contemporary, the Bach piece. I think, at least. It's melodically great. It doesn't really depict, I think, as much Baroque as some of his other music did. But anyway, he was very influential, I think, on everybody who followed him.